Hello students. In the previous lecture, we discussed the influence of early liberal philosophers and 6 key concepts of classical liberal philosophy. They include individualism, freedom, natural law, spontaneous order, rule of law and limited state and the liberal theory of international relations. We also discussed about liberal idealism, which believed that the system of international relations that caused the First World War was capable of being transformed into a fundamentally more peaceful and just world order. Now we will discuss about the classical liberal IR theory, its major features and end our discussion with some important concluding remarks. In the next lecture, we will discuss about neoliberal theory of international relations, especially the first two variants, that is the sociological liberalism and interdependence liberalism. The broad outline of our discussion would be like this. First we will discuss about the classical IR theory, then we will discuss its main features, then we will end our discussion with some concluding remarks. So let us start with the classical international relations theory. So it was not a good intellectual guide to international relations in the 1930s because interdependence did not produce peaceful cooperation and the League of Nations was helpless in the face of the expansionist power politics. So League of Nations ultimately failed to prevent the occurrence of the Second World War. So the League of Nations could not prevent the outbreak of the Second World War, and many of the expansionist powers they were doing a kind of power politics. E.H. Carr widely labeled the liberal position as utopian in contrast to his own position, which he called as realist, and maintained that utopians were guilty of naivety and exuberance. The visionary zeal stood in the way of dispassionate analysis with a clear focus away from the politics of power and security. So E.H. Carr was the first realist who severely criticized the idealist thinking of the interwar period, because he thought that they were not talking of what is, rather they are talking of what should be, and because of this visionary zeal they were not doing a proper kind of analysis of the international politics, because they were away from the politics of power and security. That is the reason led to the emergence of another new tradition in international politics in a very concrete and in a very systematic way, that was realism. The liberal international theory that carries forward the basic arguments of the classical liberal philosophy and liberal institutionalism is basically concentrated on the individual as the unit of analysis. So now let us talk about this classical international relations theory that considered the individual as the first level of analysis. This had led to a different view that the state-centric mentality of realism and brought forward the idea of pluralism in actors of international relations beside the nation state. So when you are including the individual as a level of analysis, as a unit of analysis, and you are talking of international organizations, you are talking of the state actors, you are talking of the non-state actors. So that led to a kind of plurality in international relations actors, and that you can describe as a multi-actor centric international system. The liberal international relations theory has criticized realism's inadequacy to explain international cooperation and argues that the realist analysis are confined with the limits of the narrow definition of national interest. So it was a by the classical liberal international theory that what the realists are saying about power politics, about the working of international relations, it was one-sided, because they are only talking of narrow definition of national interest. They are talking of only the nation's interest. They are not talking of the interest of the individual, interest of any other actor. So that is how they were highly critical of the realist theory. So now let us discuss about the main features of the classical liberal international theory. Thus the liberal reading of international relations is composed of both conflictual and cooperative behavior of the states, non-state entities and individuals. So, international politics is not just about confrontation, not just about competition, rather it is also about cooperative behavior of the states, non-state actors and the individuals. So, you have to think about the both sides, not just if you become unidimensional, then your understanding of the international politics will be one-sided. So, that was the point raised by the classical international liberal theory. A core argument of the liberal international theory is that concentrations of unaccountable violent power are the fundamental threat to individual liberty and must be restrained, and that is how they talked about limited state, constitutional state, separation of power between different organs of the government, because that is how you can restrain the violent power of the state that may create problems for individual liberty. The primary means of restraining power are institutions and norms, both at the domestic and the international level. So, if you want to reform international politics, if you want to understand international politics, then you have to focus on both domestic factors and international factors. That was the argument of classical international relations theory. In contrast to the realists who see the state the first and foremost as a concentration and instrument of power, liberals see the state as a constitutional entity which establishes and enforces the rule of law that respects the right of the citizens to life, liberty and property. So, unlike the realist or the realist theory which talks about state power, unlimited state power, power meant for hegemony, to maintain hegemony in international politics, the liberals are talking about a state that is a limited state and it is bound by the constitution, because in that way a limited state can enforce the rule of law and it will not be a threat to the individual life, liberty and property. So, if the state is limited, if the government is limited, if the state is ruled by the constitution, if it is a democratic country, definitely that will help to respect the rights of the individuals like life, liberty and property. At the international level, institutions and organizations like the United Nations limit the power of the states by fostering cooperation and providing a means for imposing cost on states that violate international agreements. So, if there is an international organization like the United Nations, that would help to increase cooperation between and among the nations, and it will also impose a kind of cost on states, those who violate international agreements. Just remember about the Korean War of 1950, so that created a kind of problem between the two parts of Korea, the communist North Korea and the South Korea that was supported by the USA, and North Korea was supported by China and the former USSR. And because of ideological reasons, Korea was divided after the Second World War, and immediately after 1950, there was a war between the North Koreans and South Koreans. This situation forced the international organization, the United Nations, to undertake measures for bringing peace in the Korean Peninsula. So, the point is why the United Nations was successful at that time, because the Soviet Union abstained from the Security Council resolution, and the Chinese they got their communist revolution in 1948, and they were not so powerful also. So, anyway, whatever may be the reason, it was the United Nations that maintained peace in the Korean Peninsula, and it imposed a heavy cost on North Korea. So, the point is, you can also think of the current war that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, how the America and its Western allies, they have imposed sanctions against Russia so that it cannot violate the international law or international norms. The liberal theorists argue that states care more about the absolute gain, that is a general increase in the welfare of all parties in an agreement, than the relative gains, because relative gains is basically related to the realist accounts that describe a situation where a state measures its increase in welfare relative to other states and also may shy away from any agreements that make a competitor stronger. So, we have already discussed this issue of relative gain, because whenever a country thinks that if there is an agreement, there is an organization that will lead to the increase of the power of its rival or competitor, so it will just not cooperate for any kind of international organization or regional organization. So, but the liberals take a different position, that we should not always think about relative gain, because that does not explain properly the working of international organizations, because international organizations actually care more about the absolute gain, because all the states, those who are party to the United Nations, they think that they will all benefit. If you become a member, you will get a lot of benefits, and that is how it gives a kind of security to the small and medium sized countries, because they think that if then anything wrong happens to them, there is international law, there is United Nations, there are international organizations, and at least there is international public opinion, you can't bypass that. So, if Russia was considered as an aggressor against Ukraine, it is because it did not have sufficient public opinion in its favor, because most of the world public opinion is in favor of Ukraine, that is considered as a victim, because it as a sovereign nation, it has all right to apply for NATO membership or get NATO membership. So, that is how you can nowadays say that it's a kind of perception, or it's a kind of narrative. So, those countries would win the war if they have narrative in their side. So, that is that you can understand better in case of the Russia-Ukraine war. By focusing on the more optimistic viewpoint of absolute gains and providing evidence of its existence by international organizations, liberals see a world where states are likely to cooperate in any agreement where any increase in prosperity is probable. So, all the liberals, they are of the view that if there is an international organization and the states think that they will get absolute gain out of it, definitely they will cooperate for the establishment of that international organization or for the operation of that international organization. So, the point is it is not the relative gain that always decides, but sometimes on some issues it is the absolute gain or the gain of all countries that is the deciding factor for international cooperation, for the establishment of international organizations. Economic institutions like the World Bank and IMF are particularly effective at fostering cooperation because of the substantial benefits that can be derived from economic interdependence. So, if there are Bretton Woods systems, or if there is World Bank and IMF, they are there because most of the countries think that particularly the countries of the Western Europe think that there are substantial benefits that can be derived from the economic interdependence. This economic interdependence is considered as one of the reasons that discourage nation states to go for war or to go for conflict. This situation is mutually beneficial, as a high level of trade between states decreases conflicts and makes war less likely, since war would disrupt or cancel the benefits of profit of trade. So, if it's a strong belief of the classical international relations theory that if the states are in favor of more trade and commerce, if there is a lot of interaction between them on trade and commerce issues, on many other issues or non-political issues, that would create a kind of interdependence between them, and the countries would never go for a war, because they know that if they go for a war, that will be hugely costly for them, or it would put them in a very costly position. So, that may be the reason why there are economic institutions like IMF and World Bank. States with extensive trade ties are therefore strongly incentivized to maintain peaceful relations, because by this calculation war is not profitable but detrimental to the state. So, if you go for more and more trade, more and more commerce, that will not only beneficial for your economic the state, rather it creates an additional incentive, that is it encourages more and more interdependence, it encourages more and more trade and commerce, and that is how you will not think of war, because you will always consider that war is costly and trade and commerce are profitable. So, there are many issues between the Chinese and the Americans, but they have not gone to the war because they know that they are economically integrated with each other, there are many trade issues, there are many economic issues which they can't ignore, because if they go for a war which is unthinkable between the two nuclear weapon states, that would put them in severe economic crisis. You see how countries like Sri Lanka, how countries like Pakistan, how countries like North Korea, they are fighting the economic problem, they are suffering from lots of economic issues. So nowadays you can't think of a war, because that would put you in a very uncomfortable economic situation, as we can see in case of both Russia and Ukraine. They have started the war, Russia has started the war, but it's becoming economically very costly for Russia, and it has also put Ukraine in a very uncomfortable economic position, because it is dependent on the Americans, the European countries for its military support, for its economic support. So that proves that economic interdependence is one of the major variables that discourages the countries to go for war, to go for conflict. When a state takes action contrary to these norms, they are subject to various types of cost, as we have seen in case of sanctions against Russia. So if you go against the international norm, if you go against the international law, so it's not that you will go scot free, rather you will be punished, you will be penalized by the other states who may take economic actions against you, punitive economic actions against you, that may cost to your economy, that may affect your overall economic growth. So that is how interdependence discourages the states to go for conflict and war. Spreading the liberal democracy is therefore an effective way to widen the international zone of peace inhabited by the world's democratic states. The main argument of classical liberal international theory is that because democracy is useful, because it contains violence, it reduces violence, it helps in maintaining the zone of peace in the international arena. So there is a need for more and more countries to adopt democratic system of governance, not necessarily the Western model of democracy, but they should be democratic countries, because democracies don't go war against each other, or democracy generally discourages war, because there are opposition party in a democratic country, there is a constitution and there are constitutional rules to launch a war, to wage a war, there are judicial system, there are public opinion, there are media, there are other factors like economic cost. So because of these reasons, democratic countries would never to go for a war unless and until it is extremely important for them to maintain their survival, to maintain their own identity. So that is how the liberals believe that if more and more countries become democratic countries, that would establish a zone of peace in the world. With proper diplomacy and the right governing institutions in place, liberal theorists believe that state can work together to maximize prosperity and minimize conflict, a valuable asset for the state actors. So basically the liberals believe that if there is proper diplomacy, open diplomacy, not secret diplomacy, and there are right kind of international organizations, so the states can work together to maximize prosperity and minimize conflict. So these all conditions, individual freedom, limited state, balance of power, international organizations, and the spread of democracy, the maximization of international trade and conflict, more and more international trade and commerce. So these are all factors that will encourage the states to focus on cooperation, to focus on interdependence rather than to go for a war. So in conclusion, we can argue that the liberal international relations theory views the state as a unit of analysis, but takes the principle of realism and moves them one step further by including citizens and international organizations as equally important factors in world politics. So the realist theory focuses only on the states, but liberal international relations theory goes one step further by including citizens and international organizations as important actors, important factors in understanding world politics, as opposed to the aggression of the realist theory, which assumes that power or military might is or should be the primary goal of political action. Liberalism claims that progress in human society can be measured by the elimination of global conflict, and the extent to which democracies have transcended the violent conflict. So, if you compare the realist theory with the liberal theory in terms of power or the primary goal of political action, then the realists think that your survival is the best way, your hegemony is the best way to understand your peace, your power position, your national foreign policy objectives. But in contrast to that, the liberals argue that if you are more and more democratic, if you ensure right kind of freedoms and liberties to your citizens, if you are a limited state, if you are limited by the constitution, if there are separation of power, that actually will help to reduce the possibility of conflict or possibility of violent conflicts. Thus, the liberal international theory contains a variety of concepts and arguments about how institutions, behaviors and economic connections contain and mitigate the violent power of the states. So, if you take the role of all the institutions, behaviors of the political leaders and economic connections, so combinedly together they can help you to contain and mitigate the violent power of the states. Most notably, liberalism has been the traditional foil of realism in international theory, as it offers a more optimistic view of the world grounded in a different reading of history to that found in realist scholarship. So, if you compare the realist scholarship with that of the liberal philosophy, these two theories are the competing theories, those who are using history for their own analysis for as a matter of proof to put their arguments. So, the point is whatever we discussed about realism, whatever we discussed about liberalism, they contain some elements of truth. You can't say the world operates only on the basis of which the realists argue, or the world operates only on the basis of the liberals argue, because both the theories give some kind of perspectives for understanding the world. So, if you combine both the theories, that would give us a better kind of understanding how the international politics is actually operating. So, history has been used, examples are being used by both the theories to prove their contention, to put their argument in proper perspective. Today, it is clear that liberalism is not a utopian theory describing a dream of world peace and happiness as it was once accused of being. So, you would find that liberal political philosophy in the medieval period or the idealism of the interwar period, they were all talking of something which were considered as impractical. It was considered as something idealist. It was considered something which has no historical examples. But this classical liberal international theory is arguing something, is talking of something which can be achievable, which can be realizable if we apply this theory in the understanding of international politics. It provides a consistent rejoinder to realism and firmly rooted in evidence and deep theoretical tradition. So, the liberal political tradition has a long history like realism in international relations, and whatever the liberals are saying, whatever they are arguing, that has a historical evidence. So, we have seen the League of Nations was established, but if you compare the working of the League of Nations and the United Nations, you will find the difference. So, liberalism has come a long way, and it has understood the working of international relations in a much better way in the post-war period than what it was during the interwar or the medieval period. So, that is how classical international relations theory is much more important for understanding the contemporary world politics the way the realist theory is. So, both liberal theory and realist tradition in international relations, they are speaking something, they are talking something that makes sense to us, because individually these two theories, they cannot explain everything in international politics because they give only one side of the picture. So, if you combine the liberal arguments and the realist arguments, then that both the theories will help you to understand the realities of international relations or how the international politics is actually operating. But this is not, these two theories are not the two, last theories that will help you. There are other varieties of liberalism, there are other varieties of, theories, those who are called critical theories, that will also help you to understand the working of international politics in a much better way. So anyway, we will continue our discussion. Till then, goodbye. Thank you for your patient hearing. Thank you.